Transmitiendo aquí desde la Biblioteca Nacional de Argentina, la Biblioteca Mariano Moreno. Es un gusto saludar a todos nuestra audiencia. Estamos en una sesión en la 34ª Asamblea General de ABINIA, una asociación que procura y uno de sus objetivos concretos de la Biblioteca Nacional de Argentina, la Biblioteca Mariano Moreno. Es un gusto saludar a todos nuestra audiencia. Estamos en una sesión en la 34ª Asamblea General de ABINIA, una asociación que procura y uno de sus objetivos concretos de la Biblioteca Nacional de Argentina, la Biblioteca Mariano Moreno. Es un gusto saludar a toda nuestra audiencia. Estamos en una sesión en la 34ª Asamblea General. Desde aquí, uno de nuestras misiones precisamente es apoyar y difundir el desarrollo de las bibliotecas nacionales de la región iberoamericana, y dentro de este contexto, de esta asamblea y esta organización, nos da un gusto presentar. Hemos programado 2 conferencias magistrales. La primera de ellas ocurrirá en breve, que se titula Enduring Access, Principles and Approaches to Digital Preservation, que va a exponer el doctor Trevor Owen, un especialista de la Biblioteca del Congreso de Estados Unidos. La dinámica del trabajo que vamos a hacer es, está grabada esta ponencia, esta conferencia, pero tenemos la presencia, vamos a tener la presencia para las preguntas, para responder preguntas por parte de Trevor Owens en vivo, con la participación de la doctora Isabel Galina Russell del Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas de la UNAM. Me permito celebrar este tipo de sesiones dentro de esta asamblea de ABINIA, porque representan una preocupación, mostrar los problemas que nosotros estamos enfrentando como bibliotecas nacionales y que el mundo de alguna manera está también enfrentando, que es todo lo relativo a la preservación digital y las formas de preservar nuestra memoria en nuestras nuevas plataformas. Creo que Trevor Owens es uno de los líderes en estos aspectos, en estos temas, y que va a ser de mucha utilidad el saber y enterarnos cómo se han planteado estos problemas, y una de tantas vetas que ha tomado el desarrollo de la preservación digital en el mundo. Me permito, antes de iniciar y ver la conferencia, presentar a nuestros 2 participantes. El doctor Trevor Owens es un bibliotecario, investigador, educador, que ha estado preocupado por los programas en las bibliotecas, en los archivos, en los museos, y que ha liderado dentro de la Biblioteca Nacional, dentro de la Biblioteca del Congreso de Estados Unidos de Washington, D.C., los servicios digitales, coordinando a más de 100 bibliotecarios responsables de esta especialización del Reference Librarian. Esto también incluye un reconocimiento internacional que tiene Trevor Owens en todo lo que es relativo a la preservación digital. Es actualmente historiador y invitado en la American University. Es también profesor en la Universidad de Maryland, en el departamento de College Information, y tiene una larga trayectoria. Es también parte del miembro académico de la colección de raros en la Escuela de California. Es un gusto tenerlo aquí, que haya aceptado hacer este trabajo. Tengo que decir también que existe ya una traducción en español de alguno de sus libros que hemos realizado en la Biblioteca Nacional de México, precisamente conducida esta traducción con el liderazgo de la doctora Isabel Galina Russell. Y ella es como les digo, doctora en Ciencias de la Información en University College London, es investigadora del Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas de la UNAM, es fundadora de la Red de Humanidades Digitales, la Red HD, editora de la serie Digital Research in the Arts and Humanities, y participa en el grupo Preservación Digital. Entre sus publicaciones se encuentra como coautora Introducción a la edición digital y una mirada al libro electrónico, su más reciente libro en colaboración. Así que vamos a dar paso a esta conferencia y inmediatamente vamos una vez terminada, a las preguntas y respuestas y a la presencia de nuestros dos invitados. Muchísimas gracias y adelante.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a bit about my knowledge and background with digital preservation. I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity. I'm talking a bit about themes from my book, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, which is graciously and very thankfully out in Spanish now in a translation as a result of the work of Isabel and a great team. So lots of gratitude about that. But that's also to note that everything I'm going to talk about in my talk today is also expanded upon greatly in the open access book now available in Spanish as well. So thanks in advance for the work that went to translate this into Spanish in advance of the meeting, and I will switch and start sharing my slides here. My talk today is titled Enduring Access, Principles and Approaches to Digital Preservation. As I mentioned, I'm going to work through some of the themes in my book. But to start out, I'm just going to try and make the case or sort of give an understanding of some of the big challenges around digital preservation. We're faced quite frequently with stories like this in Inc. magazine. The idea that what we post online is forever and we need a reminder of that. This is the sort of narrative that's often used these days to scare young people into being more deliberate about what they put online, which is smart. But we're simultaneously faced with the opposite kind of story as well. Scientists warn we may be creating a digital dark age, in this case from Science Friday publication. How do those two narratives fit together? We have both a warning that everything might persist forever, that we might be stuck with all of this digital information, and we might simultaneously be losing it all at once. The sort of hyperbole around digital information is really challenging. And that's the context in which I set out to write The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation. I've been working with digital information, digital preservation for the last decade and a half. And in that work, I'd come to understand the hard-earned truth that archivists, librarians, museum curators had found around working in digital preservation for the last, half century really of time. And that's the goal of this book, is to bring together those themes. The book is open access. As I mentioned, this is a copy of the preprint that's in English. But as I also mentioned, the great news is that very recently the Spanish translation also came out as open access, so that's available. But I like to use the table of contents from the book as a way to sort of give a little bit of a outline to what I see as the key problems in digital preservation. The first half of the book focuses on the way to reframe digital preservation as a problem that connects more broadly with the various lineages of preservation traditions, everything from preservation reformatting to conservation treatments, very different schools of thought and work, manuscript transcription, et cetera. There's a lot of different areas, a lot of theoretical work around understanding digital objects, and set that up as a way to work in the latter half of the book through an iterative approach for doing digital preservation work as craft, something that you don't necessarily just write all the steps down and check all the boxes, but something that is based on situational issues with the content that you're working with, while you deal with formats and copies, arrangement, description, thinking through access, all of these interrelated areas that really make digital preservation much more contiguous with work that we've done in preservation and in analog areas as well. So as a short roadmap for the talk, I'm going to give a definition of digital preservation. I'm going to share some of the highlights of 16 axioms that I opened the book with. They, in my experience, have become the best way to talk about some of the big picture themes and issues that I get into, and they tend to be a good set of conversation starters. And then I'll end the talk with a very short list of steps and resources to everyone can use to help jumpstart or improve our digital preservation practices. So to start with, we'll talk about what is and is not digital preservation. You may have seen this diagram or slightly less complex versions of it. It's the OAIS diagram that shows the relation between ingest, data management, archival storage, access, administration, and preservation planning. For many, this is what digital preservation is, a kind of complicated technical process and diagram. This is the simpler version of it, sort of a technical standard that you meet with a system design. But I take a different approach, which is, I think, consistent with where the field is increasingly going, that digital preservation is really everything that's required to ensure enduring access to digital content. And so it's not achieved by a technical solution or a diagram. It's something that is part of a long-term plan and approach, which when you really do get into the guts of the OAIS standards and things like track standards, the essence of it still is here. It's just that sometimes gets confused by the fact that it seems like the checklist really is all there is to it. So with that, I'll move into talking through some of the highlights from the axioms. I think these tend to be the things that prompt the best fodder for discussion. I think they're good at drawing out some of the somewhat contradictory or some of the things that may seem not exactly straightforward about digital preservation. So the first one is that a repository is not a piece of software. So it's often the case that organizations talking about digital preservation are talking about a specific piece of software they need to implement as if that will resolve the problem. But the core idea in my work is that software really doesn't do preservation. It can't be a repository in itself. A repository is the sum of financial resources, hardware, staff time, and ongoing implementation of policies and planning to ensure long-term access to content. So any system that you're using is actually a temporary necessity, but it's something you will also replace. So there's no software that does digital preservation. There's simply tools that you're using that you'll inevitably be swapping out. The second one is that it's institutions that make preservation possible. So bearing in mind that all of us have limited lifespans, and that without care and management, the things that matter most to us will only persist for some short period of time related to the durability of their mediums. With digital information, those mediums are actually very non-durable, right? It's keeping lots of copies of them that makes this possible to carry forward information into the future. And so really it's institutions, things like libraries, archives, museums, families, religious organizations, the groups that design those systems and work them together, and really everything from their org charts to their hiring practices, the whole ecosystem around those institutions that are what makes preservation possible. Jumping ahead to the fourth one, nothing has been preserved, there are only things being preserved. Preservation is the result of ongoing work of people and commitments of resources. So this work is never finished. This has significant ramifications for how we think about staffing and resourcing preservation work. If you want to evaluate how serious an organization is about digital preservation, I think it's best not to start by looking at their code or their storage architecture or talking to their software developers, but to start by talking to finance people. Where does the institution invest its resources and funds? And if digital preservation isn't a clear priority from that, then it's clear that it's not a priority because it is an ongoing active process. The fifth one is that hoarding is not preservation. And this is something that often when we have colleagues from IT organizations that have come into working in digital preservation, it may seem like the simplest thing to do is to just keep everything. But this is not preservation. It's problematic in that if you do just hoover up all kinds of information, but don't have clear plans for how to make that content discoverable and accessible, you'll end up with more and more of a convoluted mess of material. And while it's somewhat straightforward to keep perfect copies of a bulk set of information, if you do keep piling on more and more information without more bits, without context to interpret those, you just have a larger and larger mess for someone else to have to deal with in the future. The sixth one is, I think, an important delineation between two different areas that are easy to conflate. So backing up data is not digital preservation. Often in discussions between people with library expertise and people with IT expertise, someone might say, oh, I'm really focused a lot on digital preservation. We need to be thinking about long-term access to information. And someone might say, oh, don't worry about it. We back everything up every night. We need to be well equipped to explain why those two things aren't the same. The biggest aspect there is that being able to pull back data from a few days ago in case of a system crash or something like that, that is actually an important process to mitigate loss. But it is not related to questions of, are we going to be able to reliably produce these digital objects and render them 50 or 100 years from now? There's a different time scale of problem. It's a different kind of question. And it's just important to be able to delineate those two issues. The seventh one is that the boundaries of digital objects are fuzzy. And this seems inherently confusing. We think about digital information as being precise, as being exacting ones and zeros. But what's important to note is that individual digital objects reference and incorporate each other. You might think you have a copy of a piece of software by keeping a copy of the disk it was on, but that installer might call a web service to start downloading files, in which case if the CD really doesn't contain that software, right? It actually contains prompts to download or pull things in. Similarly, to play back a video, you might need specific other related software. So it's often challenging to articulate what's inside or outside of an object. One of my favorite examples is that if you do, download the HTML of a website, it can reference all kinds of images, but those images are not in the HTML itself, right? So the complete web page is actually a package that includes files that are being called that are not in the HTML document itself. So that fuzziness is an important, challenging aspect to think through all sorts of parts of digital preservation. The ninth one is that digital preservation is making the best use of resources to mitigate threats and risks. So you're never done with digital preservation. It's not something that can be accomplished or finished. It's a continual process of understanding risks you face for losing content or losing the ability to render and interact with that content, and making best use of the resources you have to do that. This gets back to that point I was making earlier about the difference between a technical architecture or a checklist and a risk mitigation mindset is that with the risk mitigation mindset, we're thinking more in the way that we think in terms of IT security, where there's any number of threats, right? So file format obsolescence is a threat for a particular type of content in a particular situation. Loss of bits is a threat, or in the same way, a hacker accessing your system or ransoming your system and taking your content away. All of those are different threats. And the best way to think about digital preservation is not to try and eliminate all the threats, but to prioritize them and focus on the ones that are the most likely or problematic for your given situation. The 11th is that it's long past time to start taking actions. You can read and think about complicated data models or schemas for tracking and logging preservation actions. You can read all sorts of other complex and interesting topics for years, but it's not going to help get the boxes off the floor, if you will. The most basic things that one needs to do to mitigate the most pressing risks are things that it's long past time to take action on. So be sure to be prioritizing those things before diving into many of the more open-ended questions of digital preservation. And I bring this up in part because it can be paralyzing a bit to think about the full range of things that might be threats or risks. But in many cases, an organization might have really important, valuable material that exists on a single individual's computer or something like that, right? Or a situation where an inventory isn't being maintained, and so you don't even know what the prioritized material is to be keeping track of. Those sort of very basic tasks are things that need to get prioritized over much more esoteric, complex, and in some cases still open-ended areas of research. So that's a high-level run-through of some of the axioms that I think are the most useful for us, that don't sort of pertinent for us to talk to today. So with that in mind, I'll then switch to talk through what are some of the things that we can start with today, the most pressing actions I would suggest for digital preservation work. And so from that, I would suggest, and these are things that I think all of you could do, and or are things to share with staff, people across teams, really anyone at any level of an organization can do these sorts of things. One is to start by identifying the digital stuff, the material that you've got that you need to keep. What's the things that the loss of would be particularly problematic or pressing. And an important aspect in this is that this is, of course, not everything. There are, you may have a lot of material that is redundant that all sorts of organizations have. That's not necessary to keep, right? Or material that's temporary or that the loss of would not be particularly significant. But the thing to focus on is what is unique, what is essential to your organization's mission, how to prioritize that. Then to look at what you do to get those boxes off the floor for that material. And in that case, talking about having multiple copies, having an inventory that's checked and recheckable. There's computational systems you can use to do this, but at the same time, even just somewhat manual or basic processes can be very helpful in moving this forward. And then the third thing is to schedule out and plan for improving on those things and checking in on them. So once you get those things working together, you get into a situation where you can have a virtuous cycle of continuous improvement for a digital preservation program, again, that is people with resources being supported to accomplish these tasks. And the third thing, the last three I'd offer, is that the National Digital Stewardship Alliance's Levels of Digital Preservation paper, which is the levels of digital preservation, have also been translated into a whole series of other languages, including Spanish. So they're a great resource for the international community. That is a tiered set of guidance that I'll show briefly in a moment that can be used for helping to develop plans. Then the last two I'd offer is to join communities of practice. There are a number of the Digital Preservation Coalition is a great international community working in these areas, and that you can also read The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, now either in English or in Spanish. So here's a picture of the NDSA levels of digital preservation. You can see there's each of those categories, like storage and geographic location, or file fixity and data integrity, and then they work up through level 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is very much in keeping with the idea that you want to prioritize the most pressing risks, those level 1 risks, over things that you might be getting to in the level 4 space, but that in each area depends a little bit depending on what your sort of key issues and risks are. And with that, here's another picture of my book, and I am happy to engage further and talk more about all of this. So thank you for your time.
Hola, buenos días. ¿Me escuchan?
Verte por en línea. Thank you really for your conference. Trevor, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to this meeting that we're having here in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And here are the directors. We're 16 directors of national libraries working hard, not only in preservation, in digital preservation, but in the whole demanding work of national libraries. So, Isabel, if you want to say a word or something, Trevor? Go ahead. Hello? No. You have your microphone. Hi, how are you, Trevor?
Hello, it's great
Hello.
to see everyone.
Okay.
Hola, buenos días.
Okay, Isabel, it's your turn.
Hola, buenos días a todos y a todas. Hola, Trevor, buenos días también. Me da mucho gusto saludarlos y muchas gracias por la oportunidad de presentar, el tener la oportunidad de presentar el trabajo que hemos hecho con la traducción del libro. Para nosotros era muy importante este contenido y la oportunidad, por supuesto, de que ustedes puedan platicar directamente con Trevor Owens acerca de algunas preguntas que puedan tener. Les comento que desde que conocí el trabajo de Trevor, me pareció que tenía una forma de abordar el tema de preservación digital muy útil porque no lo ve como una solución técnica únicamente. Es más que justo la solución no es técnica de la preservación digital, sino que en este libro enmarca todas las demás consideraciones que uno tiene que tener para poder desarrollar un proyecto de preservación digital. Y en ese sentido me parece un libro que tiene una muy buena combinación de aspectos teóricos y prácticos. Y fue con esa intención que decidimos desde el Grupo de Preservación Digital, que en México, hacer una traducción colaborativa del libro que se llama La teoría y el oficio de la preservación digital. El libro está disponible en acceso abierto. Creo que les habían compartido la liga previa a la reunión por si tuvieron oportunidad de leerlo. Y en esta ocasión lo que quisimos hacer, le pedía a Trevor que por favor diera una pequeña introducción sobre algunos de los puntos claves de su libro, que es el video que acaban de ver, porque él me había propuesto originalmente un conversatorio, porque dice que este tipo de cuestiones que abordan el video son buenos puntos de partida para tener una conversación. Entonces, me han pedido que ayude con la traducción, o si alguien quiere hacer la pregunta directamente en inglés, como gusten. ¿Alguna pregunta para Trevor sobre esto? Y si no, yo puedo comenzar.
¿Alguna pregunta aquí? Sé perfectamente, con toda confianza, pues, sobre lo que planteó Trevor en la introducción, en la presentación de estos requerimientos y este proceso y que no termina nunca. ¿Sí?
Bueno, si gustan, yo puedo comenzar en lo que... ¿Sí? No alcanzo a ver muy bien. Ok, creo que yo comienzo. Entonces, lo que Trevor, one of the most interesting ideas, the one that I like the most in your book is, which you mentioned at the end of your talk, which is this concept of getting the boxes off the floor, getting the digital boxes off the floor. I was wondering if you can kind of expand on this idea, because I think it's a really good way to start. I'm just going to repeat the question in Spanish before you give your answer. Le he preguntado ahora a Trevor sobre esta idea que él menciona al final de su ponencia, que es de levantar las cajas digitales del suelo, ¿no? Que a mí me parece como una forma como muy práctica de empezar a abordar el problema, entonces le he pedido que expanda un poco más sobre esa idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit and then you can cut me off if you want to translate part of it.
Okay, yes, please.
So I think the biggest idea in that is that when you take seriously the risk mitigation idea of digital preservation.
Sí, una de las ideas principales ahí es que cuando uno toma en serio la cuestión de la mitigación del riesgo en la preservación digital,
that there are a lot of little things that we can do to mitigate risks.
Que hay muchas cosas como muy pequeñas que podemos ir haciendo para mitigar los riesgos.
And that we need to not lose track of all the little things we could do if we're focusing on only really big things.
Sí, es decir, no perder de vista que podemos hacer muchas cosas pequeñas y no solamente pensar en grandes acciones para la preservación digital.
And if you walk into an archive and saw all the boxes on the floor, we'd have a very immediate response to say, get the boxes off the floor. But with digital things, it's not, people don't see the boxes in the same way. So I think people don't necessarily have the same kind of immediate reaction.
Y nosotros entráramos a un archivo, una biblioteca y viéramos que está lleno de cajas en el suelo, tendríamos una reacción muy inmediata de cómo podemos hacer para actuar. Y que dentro de la preservación digital, pues esas cosas tan inmediatas, luego no las podemos ver tan claramente. Entonces la importancia de decir, bueno, tengo que primero, ¿no? Por lo menos quitar las cajas del suelo para comenzar con los procesos. Thanks, Trevor. Something that, perdón.
¿Alguna pregunta sobre esto?
Sí, pues vamos a compartir el libro por el chat. Sí, ya está.
Adelante.
Sí, gracias.
Adelante, Isabel.
Perfecto. Given Trevor that that most of the directors that are gathered here in this meeting are they're all from national libraries, and usually national libraries kind of share very specific mission, which is gathering and preserving all that is published in a country. I would wonder, because I know Library of Congress isn't exactly a national library, but it has, I think it shares some of the missions. I'm not quite sure. But what would you suggest could be important types of materials that maybe we could focus on being national libraries? Le preguntaba a Trevor Owens acerca de la situación de las bibliotecas nacionales en particular, pensando que compartimos y tenemos generalmente objetivos y misiones muy similares. Si hay ciertos tipos de materiales que cree que son particularmente importantes para las bibliotecas nacionales en términos de preservación digital.
Yes. So first, one thing I'll say is that because of how rights and content management increasingly works for digital information, it's increasingly the case that many academic libraries do not have any copies of digital publications, ebooks, e-journals. They only rent access to them.
Sí. Bueno, uno de los primeros conceptos que es importante para las bibliotecas académicas, sobre todo, es que es raro que las bibliotecas tengan una copia del libro electrónico o de los contenidos electrónicos. Muchas veces ahora lo que se hace es que se tiene una suscripción que nos da acceso a ciertos contenidos digitales, pero no necesariamente contamos con una copia.
So, national libraries that have copyright deposit or legal deposit have an ability to get material that almost no other libraries can get.
Por lo tanto, las bibliotecas nacionales que justamente generalmente tienen el depósito legal pueden entonces tener esa capacidad de tener acceso a estas copias de libros electrónicos que la mayoría de las bibliotecas ya no pueden tener.
So, digital newspapers, digital journals, ebooks, but then any other area that national libraries uniquely collect in, film, etc., all are, I think, very relevant.
Entonces, por ejemplo, periódicos, revistas, él también menciona cine, dependiendo del tipo de colecciones que tienen, son particularmente relevantes en cuestiones de colectar para la preservación digital.
And the other big area I see as really important for national libraries is web archives and archiving the web, which I know several of the libraries of directors here are involved with web archiving programs, and those are very important.
Y otra de las áreas, la otra área muy importante que él ve de colección para las bibliotecas nacionales en lo que se refiere a preservación digital es en lo que tiene que ver con archivar web. Con los archivar sitios, web archiving. Él dice que sabe que varias de las bibliotecas nacionales de los que están aquí representados ya tienen programas en este aspecto.
But I think lastly, I would say that any area in analog that national libraries collect in, it's generally the case that digital collecting will be important there too. So, for example, manuscript collections or geography and maps, any of those areas, as the transition to digital happens in all of these areas, it's important to track that.
Sí, y bueno, y las áreas en donde tradicionalmente se recogen los materiales impresos, si por ejemplo son mapas, manuscritos, pues eso también conforme se va haciendo la transición a lo digital, pues también ir pensando en esas colecciones.
Tenemos una pregunta aquí del director de la Biblioteca Nacional de Paraguay.
Sí.
Le paso el micrófono para que haga la pregunta y tú la traduces.
Sí, claro. A question now from the director of the National Library of Paraguay.
Sí, buenos días. Actualmente las universidades americanas, ¿qué tecnología técnicamente están utilizando para la preservación digital? En nuestro caso, de libros y diarios.
No escuché la primera parte. En el caso de, ¿dónde, perdón?
¿Qué tecnología utilizan las bibliotecas norteamericanas para la digitalización de periódicos y libros?
Gracias. ¿Qué tecnologías
Preservación.
están usando las bibliotecas en Estados
No,
Unidos?
preservación. ¿Qué tecnología de preservación?
¿Qué tecnología de preservación?
Sí.
Okay. They're asking what technology of preservation. ¿Con tecnología de preservación se refiere a los procesos? ¿O una tecnología como un software?
Los tipos de software que están utilizando para la preservación digital.
Trevor, the director just asked what type of software you're using for digital preservation in, I think, in libraries in the United States, I guess also in particular the library where you are at.
Sure. At the Library of Congress, we have a number of systems we've developed ourselves over time.
Y en la Biblioteca del Congreso utilizan sistemas que ellos han ido desarrollando a lo largo del tiempo.
And we're working on internal transitions with those. But a lot of organizations use systems like Preservica, that's commercial, or systems like Islandora or Fedora. There's a number of open source software systems.
Ok. ¿Hay alguna pregunta? Ellos desarrollan las tecnologías y hay otro tipo de compañías que utilizan ya un software de preservación, pero ellos han desarrollado su propia tecnología en la Biblioteca del Congreso. We have other questions in the web.
Sí, el público preguntaron que él había hablado sobre priorizar el problema de las amenazas y quieren saber de las amenazas a preservar colecciones digitales y quieren saber cuáles son esas amenazas.
Gracias. This is a question from from the general audience, and they say that during the talk you talked about risk, about threats to preservation. They were wondering if you could give some examples of these risks.
Sure. So first, the NDSA levels of digital preservation are organized around risks, and so that is one resource that's useful, but I'll provide some examples.
Okay. Él recomienda los niveles de riesgo de la NSDA, que los mencionó en su última diapositiva, que por cierto les comento, estos niveles ya están traducidos al español, entonces también pueden ser utilizados. Ese modelo está diseñado alrededor de riesgos, entonces ahí están mencionados los riesgos, sin embargo, nos va a dar unos ejemplos también.
So, most basic risk is risk of loss of content.
Okay. El riesgo más básico es el riesgo de perder el contenido.
So if you only have one copy of your content and someone drops it, then it's all gone.
Entonces, por ejemplo, si solo tienes una copia de un contenido y no sé, se te cae o hay algún tipo de problema, entonces ya lo pierdes ese objeto.
But similarly, if you have 3 copies of the content, but one person can accidentally delete all 3 at once, that you still have no content then, if they do that.
Otro riesgo, por ejemplo, es aunque tengas 3 copias de ese mismo contenido, pero una sola persona puede borrar esos 3 archivos, entonces pues también sigue teniendo un cierto riesgo de perder ese contenido.
And from this, basically everything, thinking about what the worst risks are that you face, the most pressing challenges, is a way to prioritize approaching actions around digital preservation.
Y una de las formas de dar prioridad a cómo ir solucionando la preservación digital es justo ver cuáles son los contenidos que tienen el mayor riesgo o los de desaparecer, y entonces así uno puede ir asignando prioridades.
As one more example, another risk is ability to render content in the future.
Otro ejemplo es la capacidad de poder reproducir ese contenido en un futuro.
And so determinations about what file formats you acquire or don't, for instance, are a way that you impact managing that risk of rendering content in the future.
Entonces, por ejemplo, el tipo de archivos, el formato en el cual se encuentra el archivo, pues eso, dependiendo en qué formato está, pues va a tener distintos riesgos conforme se va a poder reproducir ese contenido en el futuro. Thanks.
Una pregunta de la directora de la Biblioteca Nacional de Brasil.
¿Cree que la preservación digital debe tratarse como una política pública?
This is from the director of the National Library of Brazil, and she asks if you think that digital preservation should be treated as public policy.
I think if you think about records management is increasingly digital preservation issues. So that's one area where there's a clear concern for public policy. And the second one, I think the functions and operations of national libraries are also very much a concern of public policy. And so as digital preservation is really critical to those two areas, I think there's a lot of relevance there. And the last one I would say is copyright policies within each nation are also very clearly related, and legal deposit are also public policy issues.
Thanks. Cada vez más los archivos pues se manejan, el manejo de archivos es digital, por lo cual pues eso está muy relacionado con políticas públicas. De la misma forma, muchas veces las bibliotecas nacionales pues tienen una función, por lo cual también inciden en política pública. De la misma forma, también comenta que todo lo relacionado, por ejemplo, con los derechos patrimoniales, los derechos de autor, que también tienen todo este factor digital, así como el depósito legal, también con esta transición hacia lo digital, pues todo eso está muy relacionado con la preservación digital. Y son lugares en donde incidiría.
No sé, ¿alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Sí.
Sí.
Perdón, actualmente, ¿cuántas personas están trabajando en el área de preservación digital en la Library of Congress?
This is usually one of my favorite questions. She just asked how, I don't know who it was, sorry. Disculpe, no sé quién habló, pero voy a traducir la pregunta. How many people work in digital preservation at the Library of Congress?
Sure. So for context, the Library of Congress has something on the several thousand staff, but the library part of the Library of Congress, because we have the Copyright Office and the other units. So the total staff of the Library of Congress is the library part is probably around 1,200. And of that, there are probably 20 or 30 people who deal with digital preservation in some way, but I would stress that they, most of them have digital content management or collections processing as part of their work. So it's not what they do all time, but it's woven into the work of them they do.
Para dar contexto a su respuesta, nos comenta que en la parte de la biblioteca del Congreso, más o menos tienen como 1,200 personas trabajando y que de esas, más o menos 20 o 30 personas trabajan en preservación digital. Pero sí comenta que algunas de estas personas no solamente hacen preservación digital, sino que también hacen manejo y procesamiento de contenidos digitales y la preservación digital es una parte de su trabajo.
I would like to make a question, Trevor. I don't know, well, in Ibero-American national libraries, we have a lot of problems. One of those problems are that we don't have financial money to take care about buying a software of preservation or digital preservation. And the problem is we have to make a lot of recollections, but at the same time we have to identify what kind of software are using all the digital, the legal depositor, the digital legal depositor. So what do you recommend for our libraries to start with? We need some recommendations about this problem.
Yes. Sorry, Trevor,
yeah.
just before you start, I'm going to translate it to Spanish for other people. El director de la Biblioteca Nacional de México comenta que en las bibliotecas nacionales iberoamericanas, bueno, uno de los problemas que nos afecta constantemente es el financiamiento y el apoyo. Y entonces pregunta si nos puede hacer como alguna recomendación de algún software o de algún lugar en donde se pueda ir empezando con esta problemática. Thanks.
Yeah. So the first recommendation I would have is that the comprehensive software systems are often expensive and take a lot of work to implement.
Dice que su primera recomendación es que los sistemas de preservación digital generalmente muy sofisticados o muy comprensivos que abarcan absolutamente todo, son difíciles de implementar.
And they create in sometimes as many problems as they solve.
Y que muchas veces crean casi la misma cantidad de problemas que resuelven.
So my main recommendation is to identify staff who can work on the problem and then have them go for it.
No, it's fine.
And then have them look at each of the functions like delivery, checking, integrity, inventory, and look at ways to improve processes that might be smaller. It might be things like scripts, but not necessarily focus efforts all on one big system or to implement.
Su principal recomendación es más que pensar en un gran sistema que se va a implementar, es enfocarse en qué personas, identificar qué personas dentro del staff pueden empezar a trabajar sobre algunos de los procesos, como el inventario, los procesos, cuáles son las cosas que se quieren que hacer para poder estar implementando más en pequeño que tratar de encontrar una solución grande.
But the most important thing is having some staff that are researching and focused on this, because my opinion is not going to be attuned to the organizational context of each of your libraries, and they can help figure that out best.
Lo más importante es identificar quiénes son las personas que dentro de la institución, dentro de la organización, que pueden empezar a investigar y enfocarse en esta problemática, porque dice que su opinión finalmente no va a tener el contexto institucional que ustedes conocen de cada uno de sus lugares de trabajo, por lo cual se necesita encontrar a las personas dentro que pueden justo responder esas preguntas sobre cuáles son las necesidades que se tienen que atender antes de la compra de algún tipo de sistema o la implementación de algún tipo de sistema.
Thank you very much. No sé si hay alguna pregunta más. Vamos a hacer sí. ¿El qué? Ah, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Here from the director of Panama is asking, what is your recommendation to hire? What kind of professional we need to hire to start this process of digital preservation? Go ahead.
Yeah. Increasingly, library schools are including digital preservation in work. I think, but I don't know necessarily what the curriculums are in each of your countries, if that's the case or not. But I guess I would also, I think, Isabel, you probably know as much, if not more. A lot of the people who worked on translating the book, I think, are exactly the people with some of the people in the,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, what are the professionals that you hire? Forget about our now the answer that will say, Isabel, what's your experience? What do you hire? What's the profile?
Sure. So for hiring, a lot of what we've hired for two things, or a couple things. One, people who understand work in libraries to begin with. They have to understand the context. Two, people that have learned technical skills like scripting or working with Python, so they can help develop solutions. And the third one is project management and program planning skills. Those are, I think, the three biggest ones that I'd focus on in some of our hiring.
Thank you. La pregunta de la directora de la Biblioteca Nacional de Panamá fue acerca de cuál es el perfil del profesional que se contrata para hacer este tipo de trabajo. Comentó Trevor Owens que en Estados Unidos, en Estados Unidos, que es el área que él conoce, cada vez es más común que en las escuelas de bibliotecología se imparta algo de preservación digital. Desconoce cuál es la situación en nuestra región. Comentó que a lo mejor yo podría decir algo al respecto, por lo menos en el posgrado de bibliotecología y estudios de la información en la UNAM, ya se empieza a ver módulos sobre preservación digital como parte de la formación de los bibliotecarios, de los y las bibliotecarias. Por el otro lado, de todas formas, él menciona 3 características de la gente que le interesa contratar para la preservación digital. Primero es que tengan o que conozcan las bibliotecas o que tengan un perfil bibliotecario. El otro es que sepan algunos skills técnicos, por ejemplo, que sepan algo de scripting o de Python, por ejemplo, un lenguaje de programación para que puedan ellos proporcionar soluciones. y la otra es que tengan conocimientos de administración de proyectos.
Tenemos una pregunta de público que trabaja en bibliotecas, pero está fuera de aquí.
¿Sería posible pensar en un trabajo de preservación digital de manera colaborativa entre bibliotecas nacionales? Es decir, pensar en una división de trabajo en la que se distribuyeran las labores entre diferentes bibliotecas nacionales. ¿Cuáles serían los elementos a considerar? ¿Cuáles serían los riesgos más graves? ¿Podría ser una manera de resolver las dificultades que enfrentan algunas bibliotecas nacionales para llevar a cabo los procesos de preservación digital?
Well, we have to, it's a long question. I don't know if you can just summarize this.
Sí, sí, gracias. Sí, lo voy a resumir un poquito. Somebody from the audience is asking if we could think of a model of collaborative digital preservation amongst national libraries, if that could be a possible solution. And how do you think that this could be done? And if you see any kind of risks or advantages to this?
Sure, I think, and to keep it short, the national libraries tend to be nationally funded, and so trying to, it is often like partnerships are exciting, but it's also like important that we're all our stakeholders are independent, or each of our nations, so that's challenging. But I think the best way for collaboration is through things like the IIPC, the International Internet Preservation Consortium, or the Digital Preservation Consortium, where there are groups that are from national libraries that collaborate and confer to develop approaches.
Okay. Dice que obviamente las colaboraciones siempre son positivas, sin embargo es importante, como las bibliotecas nacionales generalmente están financiadas por los gobiernos de los distintos países, pues es importante asegurarse de que los stakeholders, perdón, no recuerdo ahorita la palabra en español, bueno, los que tienen la toma de decisiones, pues que puedan estar contentos con este tipo de colaboraciones. Lo que él sugiere más bien es la participación en colaboraciones internacionales, como por ejemplo la IIPC o la DPC, que es la Digital Preservation Coalition, que también se mencionó hace rato, que son grupos internacionales en donde incluso están subgrupos de bibliotecas nacionales en las cuales se puede participar. Y bueno, obviamente a mí me gustaría añadir que a nivel latinoamericano está la PREDIC, que es la Asociación de Preservación Digital, y por supuesto el Grupo de Preservación Digital.
Sí, sobre esto, en la Biblioteca Nacional de México tenemos un grupo de preservación que incluso ya está invitando gente fuera de México, que hay participantes de Chile, de algunos lados, pueden, por supuesto, creo que es la mejor manera de trabajar. Vamos a hacer una última, last question. I know that we're running on time, but creo que de la directora de Costa Rica, de la Biblioteca Nacional de Costa Rica, tiene una pregunta.
Hola, Trevor y Isabel. Bueno, parcialmente la contestaron ya con esto, pero quisiera saber si alguno de estos organismos tiene alguna cooperación a la que puedan los países aplicar, por ejemplo, pensando en establecer ya un plan de trabajo más en preservación, si alguno de estos organismos que mencionaste tiene algún área de cooperación directa o hay algún fondo especial o algo así, pensando en buscar recursos para poder empezar un trabajo ya más serio.
Okay. Gracias. That was the director of the National Library of Costa Rica, and she was asking if some of these international organizations have cooperation or funding possibilities to start implementing digital preservation in these in some countries?
Not to my knowledge. My understanding is that the funding around digital preservation is largely regional and from governments and states.
Sí, la respuesta es que hasta donde él sabe, no. Dice que la mayoría de los proyectos de preservación digital en bibliotecas nacionales pues es financiado por cada una de las naciones.
Well, really, thank you very much. I think we are at the end of this conversation and this conference. Really, we appreciate all your experience and your information. It's really powerful for us. So, thank you very much, Isabel. Gracias por la presentación y por todo tu esfuerzo y tu organización, tu dedicación, tu traducción, etcétera. Ha sido una experiencia muy importante. Pueden, incluso para nuestro público que está ahorita viéndonos, o quienes no hayan podido conectarse, está esta conferencia, ya se colgó de la Biblioteca Nacional de Argentina en su YouTube, en su página de YouTube. Así que pueden consultarla y revisarla. Thank you very much again and see you in some time. You are in California now?
Washington, D.C.
In D.C. Okay. Okay, so see you then. Y gracias, Isabel. No sé si quieras decir algo, or if you want to say some words, Trevor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. I was really happy to hear that there was interest from the directors in this topic. I think it's a very important issue for all national libraries. So I think it's great that you're focused on it. And I hope that the work Isabel's team did to translate the book can be of broad use as all of you look at this issue with your staffs.
Isabel?
Gracias. Sí, muchas gracias. Gracias a todos por su atención. Las invito a leer el libro. Es un libro bastante corto, de muy fácil lectura y bueno, lo recomiendo ampliamente. Espero que ayude a resolver alguna de estas cuestiones.
Thank you y gracias y hasta luego, como dicen los norteamericanos. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Bye.
Gracias.